parak in the Shmona Prakim of the Rambam. And as we indicated, the sixth parak is called, this is the Rav Shmuel Ibn Tibon's translation from the Arabic, because it was written in Arabic. Behafresh asher bein ha-Chassid ha-Ma'ula ubein ha-Kovesh es Yitzro v'ha-Moshel b'nafshei. The distinction between the person that is the highest level of Chassid. Chassid here does not mean a Beshtian Chassid, does not refer to the Baal Shem Tov, but a Chassid means a person who is totally pious and pure. The difference between the Chassid and the person who conquers his Yetzer Hara and rules over his baser impulses. So the Rambam first brings the position of philosophers, Amru ha-Filosofim. And as one would know, whenever the Rambam brings philosophers, he is referring specifically to Aristotle, that the Rambam considered to be the greatest of the philosophers. Now again, the Rambam was not alone in this. In the Middle Ages generally, Aristotle was the Bible, so to speak. If you didn't believe in the Bible, you didn't believe in the Torah, Aristotle was, lahavdil, infinite havdalas, kind of the Bible of the Middle Ages. The Rambam did not know Aristotle through the Greek of Aristotle, but Aristotle was translated into, number one, Latin, of course, but primarily into Arabic. And therefore, the Rambam, who was very conversant with all of the great Arabic philosophers of the time, basically knew Aristotle through the Arabic translations and commentaries. And when the Rambam says philosophim, he therefore means both Aristotle and the Arabic philosophers who translated Aristotle. Just to remind you of, in the sense of the history, they don't use these names anymore, but the old names for this period was that the period that the Rambam lived, which we call the Middle Ages, or part of the Middle Ages, but that early part of the Middle Ages was actually called the Dark Ages. Again, I don't think the term is used much, but when I was in grammar school, they were called the Dark Ages until the Renaissance and the like, and that was primarily because in the Christian countries of Europe, Germany, England, France, there was a lot of ignorance. Basically, life was very primitive. There was very little literature, and the only ones who preserved the wisdom of Greece and Rome were in fact the Islamic countries. It's so interesting that Islam has gone through so many ups and downs. I mean, during the so-called Dark Ages of Europe, prior to the Renaissance, Islamic culture was the highest in the world, other than Jewish culture. Then Islam became very, very primitive. And to this day, more or less, it is relatively primitive compared to the Western civilization. But be it as it may, the Rambam brings Aristotle, and Aristotle says, I'll read you the line inside, HaMoshel b'nafsho afal pi sha'osa hamasim atovim v'chashuvim. One who has to control his base passions, even though he is doing very good deeds, hu osa osam, and he does good deeds, v'hu misaveh el hapulos haraos v'nichsaf aleim, but he still has a yearning, he still has a desire for evil deeds, and he yearns to do them. V'yichbaish es Yitzro, but he has the strength of conquering his Yetzer Hara. He says that is not yet the highest level of Chassid. That's called Kovesh es Yitzro, but that, the philosophers say, is inferior to the Chassid. Because what is a Chassid? Aval ha-Chassid hu nimshach b'pulaso achar ma sheteireu tavaso tchunaso. His actions are a consequence of his desires and his yearnings. Meaning to say, he desires, he yearns to do good, and therefore he perfected, or he was born perfected, with a nature that yearns to do good. So that person is spiritually a higher level because he no longer has a desire for evil. His desire is only for good. So as a result, the philosophers draw a distinction. Again, I don't know what the Arabic terms are here, and I certainly don't know the Aristotelian terms, but the two terms that we have in the Hebrew translation is Chassid versus Kovesh es Yitzro. Kovesh es Yitzro desires to do bad, but controls himself. Chassid is the person whose very desire is to do good and virtuous behavior. And according to the philosophers, the Chassid is a better person than the Kovesh es Yitzro. Now, the truth of the matter is, these are pure types, meaning if we just analyze ourselves, we will see that most of us might be mixtures of these two attributes, meaning to say there may be mitzvos and good things that we genuinely are excited to do, and we would be repulsed. I mean, most of us, for example, to take a very gross example, most of us don't have a conscious, strong desire to kill somebody. Okay, so it's not like, I really want to kill that guy, but I'm going to control myself. We might say that as an expression, although one shouldn't talk that way. But even if you're careless in your speech and you say to I really want to kill that guy, usually you don't mean that. So we could say that when it comes to killing, I have no desire to kill people. And yet when it comes to other things like not speaking Lashon Hara, or to bittul Torah, not to learn Torah, I might have a strong desire, to fool around or to battle or to say Lashon Hara. So the truth of the matter is, this notion that you're either a Chassid or you're a Moshel Yitzro is not really true in a complete sense, because most of us are going to be mixtures. But for purposes of analysis, we can analyze these as typologies, we can analyze these as archetypes, meaning what is the spiritually higher level? To be a person who has passions to do bad, but I have the koach of restraining myself? Or is the higher madrega not to yearn for that evil at all? Because as long as I'm yearning for that evil, I'm connected to it. There is some defect in my neshama that my neshama is not totally pure. Yeah.
When the Torah is discussing kosher and non-kosher animals, Rashi brings the statement that it's better to say, I would want to eat these animals, but what can I do? Hashem's telling me not
Yeah.
to, than just to say these animals.
Yeah, very, very excellent. The Rambam will in fact bring that very Maimer Chazal. Rashi got it from a Chazal. The Rambam will in fact bring that as a proof to the other position. So Baruch Shekivanta. Someone had another? Yeah.
Also, I hear the terms like Chassid, Kovesh, there is differently in different sources. For example, these two phrases in Tanya, Benoni and Tzaddik.
Yeah.
So it's exactly the same thing but different phrases. So how do you organize all these terms? Because I see everywhere it's
Yeah, you're raising a very, very good question. In different sefarim of machshava, of hashkafa, of musar, you will also often find that the same underlying concepts are expressed with different terminologies. And that can throw you off because, for example, and the other way around too. In other words, sometimes the same idea is expressed in different words. And what's even more confusing is different ideas are expressed with the same word. So for example, when the Rambam says Benoni and the Balatanya says Benoni, they mean two very, very opposite things. So that can throw you off as well. So how do you organize it? Well, that's a problem. But you think about it, you make listings, you make outlines, and then you try to ask yourself, are these the same ideas? Are these different ideas? It is true, because every mechaber will often have a unique vocabulary of expressing their terms, and it is important. Let me give you another little example, which maybe is not as philosophically complicated. Let's say Chazal talk about liasid lavo. In the future, things will be different. Now, liasid lavo itself doesn't mean the same thing in different passages. Sometimes it refers to olam haba. Sometimes it refers to Mashiach. Sometimes it refers to Techiyas HaMesim, right? So you make a mistake when you assume that the same word always means the same thing. And in fact, not only that, but when Chazal say Olam Haba, they may not be referring to the same thing that the Rambam says when he uses Olam Haba. So you are correct that terminology can sometimes throw you off very much. But here, again, we're learning the Rambam, so we're going with the Rambam. Again, I don't know what the Arabic was, but at least the translation of the Rambam's terminology is the Chassid is the person who is not misavel ra'ah. He has no taiva for bad, because his neshama wants to do good. Now, again, that could be in a limited context, but at least he's a chassid legabe a certain thing, because he is mitzaveh only to the good, and the moshel b'nafsho, which the Balatanya would call the Benoni, here you are correct, is the person that's mitzaveh. The philosophers take the position, the chassid clearly wins, that in God's esteem, the chassid is greater. I'll actually go back to the Tanya after we go over this a little bit. Okay. Now, then the Rambam says that we have, however, in our tradition, well, first of all, the Rambam does bring a few proofs that support the philosophers. He does bring a pasuk from Mishlei. And the pasuk of Mishlei says, this is Mishlei Perek Chaf Aleph, Nefesh Rasha, Ifsara, the soul of a Rasha, Ifsa, loves bad. So the suggestion of that pasuk is, it doesn't say the soul of the Rasha does bad. See, the Rambam is making a diak here. If it would say the soul of the Rasha does bad, that just means you weren't Kovesh or Yitzro Hara. But by saying the soul of the Rasha loves bad, that connotes, the Rambam is suggesting, that even if you control yourself and you don't do bad, the very fact that you love evil still means you have the soul of a Rasha. In other words, you see the Rambam's diak. Because if it just meant that the soul of a Rasha does bad, and that's why he's bad, because of what he does, it should have said, Nefesh Rasha Ose Ra. But by saying Nefesh Rasha Ifsara, that implies that your soul is still the soul of a Rasha, even though you control yourself because you have the desire for evil, and therefore that's a chisaron. And then similarly, he brings an opposite pasuk about a tzaddik, Simcha letzaddik asos mishpat. That when a tzaddik does what is right, his soul is rejoicing. He gets joy in doing good, right? So it's really one pasuk, really. It's just the second half of the pasuk that the Rambam brings, that this supports the philosopher's position that as long as you desire to do evil, your soul is in a defective condition. But then the Rambam says that we find opposite proofs. We actually find Kovesh es Yitzro is a superior level. And the Rambam brings 3 Mamorei Chazal that support the Kovesh es Yitzro as the paradigm of the truly righteous person. The first one I'm going to say for last, because the first one I think is actually a problematical right. But let me go through the number 2 and number 3, then we'll go backwards and look at number 1. The first is the statement in Pirkei Avos, in Aramaic, famous statement that I know that you know, Lefum Tsara Agra. According to the suffering is the reward. That God rewards you based on the suffering and the effort that you put forth in doing a mitzvah. If a mitzvah is easy for you because you love it and you have no desire to do the opposite, it's still a mitzvah. Of course, Hashem will reward you, but the reward is so much greater, right? If you like to sleep late and you get up for davening, and another person just loves getting up at 5 in the morning, and he's full of energy. So in Shemayim, the person who struggles to get up has more reward because your reward is based on the tsar that you go through. Famous Chazal, Lefum Tsara Agra. So the Rambam says that implies Kovesh etz Yitzro is the higher Madrega. And the third level, I'll go back to the first, is exactly the Maimer Chazal that you said. This is from the Toras Kayanim, and Rashi brings it in Chumash. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Aimer. Lo yaimar adam, efshi lachol basar b'chalav, efshi lilbo shatnes, efshi lavo ala erva. A person should not say, I don't want to eat basar b'chalav. Ugh, cheeseburgers are so disgusting. Or a person says, oh, shatnes. It's hard to imagine exactly why a person would have a repulsion towards it. Oh, wool and linen, ugh, can't stand it. Or erva, whatever it is. A person should say, I want to do it. I'd love to do it. But what can I do? Hashem said not to do it. Hashem's commandments have to be final, no matter what my feelings are. Right? A person shouldn't say, I don't want to do it. A person should say, I would want to do it, but I'm not doing it because of the tzivoy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So both Lefum Tzara Agra and Lo Yaimar Adam, which Rashi brings in Chumash, seem to indicate the Maila of Kovesh es Yitzray. Now then the Rambam brings a first raya, which, okay, I'll tell you what it says, and then I'll show you why I think there's a little bit of a problem. This is, again, a well-known Gemara in Sukkah. Kol ha-godayel mechaveirei Yitzray Gadol mimenu. Right, what does that mean? The greater a person is, the stronger their Yetzer Hara. The greater a person is, the stronger or the larger or the more powerful is the Yetzer Hara. So the Rambam is trying to read out of that statement that as you become greater and greater, you're not moving to the level where you don't have those taivas. Rather, the taivas will even grow stronger, but because you're greater, you will have the greater koach to withstand. Kol hagadol mechaveirei Yitzrei gadol mimenu. Now, the emes is, the reason why it's a little bit of a problem is, let's try to understand what that statement even means, because that statement is a little problematical. Are we referring to baser Yetzer Haras? I mean, what does it mean? Rav Chaim Kanevsky had a stronger desire for a cheeseburger than we might have. I mean, what does it even mean? It seems incomprehensible that great tzaddikim, great gedolim, have stronger Yetzer Haras for the lowly things that might be machshalas. So I think the Meforshim learn up in Ort that when it says, directly on the text there, when it says, Kol hagadol mechaveirei Yitzrei gadol, it does not mean that the Yetzer Hara that grows will be the Yetzer Hara for the lowliest things that a person did when they were in a low level, but it refers primarily to things like gaiva. In other words, that would be an nisayon. Like, what's the Yetzer Hara of a gadol, right? So, not that we know, but we can imagine. Like, the Yetzer Hara of a gadol is not, gee, I really wish, it could be mazana, be ish, or whatever it would be. That's not what a gadol thinks of. But what happens is, maybe even in a subconscious way, the whole world comes to you, and they call you Gadol Ador, and Rabban shall call B'nai Agola. So the real nisayon of a gadol is in fact gaiva, because gaiva can be very pernicious. Like Chaim Kanevsky knew. I mean, again, did he ever think about it? I don't know, but he knew. He knew more than like anybody in the world. So that could do something to you, and tragically, very tragically, that can be very, very poisonous. Very poisonous. The gaiva comes in, and it can act as a poison to bring down even the greatest person. Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Moshe Feinstein's father was a Rav in Russia. And when Rav Moshe Feinstein was already 9 years old, he already knew the 3 bavas by heart. 9 years old, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra, 3 bavas by heart. This is at 9 years old. So when Rav Moshe, little Rav Moshe, 9 years old, would walk through the town, people would stand up for him already. The Balabatim would stand up for this little boy because he was such a guy. And the father was furious. The father was furious at the people. He was their Rav. He said, you're going to ruin my son? You're going to make him a Balgaiva at 9 years old? That's going to destroy everything. He was very, very, very makpid that people don't show any unusual covet. And so gaiva can be very, very destructive. And parents need to know this, by the way, because sometimes, well, first of all, everybody likes to think that their son is a genius. I mean, that's whatever. And, occasionally it might be true. Most of the time it's not even true, but occasionally it might be true. But you have to be careful. On one hand, I'm just thinking out loud, it is very important to be positive, to compliment, to build up self-esteem. Those things are very important. In other words, you shouldn't be a situation where you never compliment your son or your child, son or daughter, or build them up. On the other end, there is a point of not being too effusive, not being too much, because gaiva could be very, 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 very poisonous. Another example, again, just a story, Rav Yisro Zalman Meltzer. Rav Yisro Zalman Meltzer, it's a funny thing today, if you ask anybody who knows, who is Rav Yisro Zalman Meltzer? So everybody will tell you, he was Rav Aaron Kotler's father-in-law, which happens to be true. But the truth is, in a way, that's a shtickle bizayon for Rav Yisro Zalman Meltzer, because that implies, Rav Yisro Zalman Meltzer's yichus is he had this great son-in-law, which of course he did. But one has to know, Rav Yisro Zalman Meltzer was a great, 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 great gadol in his own right. He also was known for his midos tovos. In fact, somebody once said when Rav Yisro Zalman died, and Rav Yisro Zalman was a great guy, a great, great guy, but somebody said, even if Rav Yisro Zalman would never have learned a blot of Gemara at all, he would have been the greatest Jew in Yerushalayim because of his midos alone. That's how great he was in terms of his midos. So they tell a story, again, I'm digressing a little bit, but I want to share the story, that there was a certain sugar bowl that he liked, that on Sukkot they would take out a sugar bowl, and he would have that sugar bowl in front of him for tea or whatever it would be. And one Sukkot, when they were setting up the Sukkah, they couldn't find the sugar bowl. And Rav Yisro Zalman was kind of a little agitated. Where's the sugar bowl? I need the sugar bowl. Where's the sugar bowl? He didn't understand. What is he making such a big fuss? And finally, he says they couldn't find it. It was Chol HaMoed Sukkot. They needed the sugar bowl. So finally, he was so agitated, he then took a piece of paper and he wrote something on the paper. And this is Chol HaMoed. He never wrote on Chol HaMoed. So they didn't understand what's going on. What is he going so crazy about the sugar bowl? And when they don't have the sugar bowl, he writes on Chol HaMoed, which he never does. What's going on? So here's the story. It's a little bit of a complicated story. The sugar bowl had a pasuk on it. He had a sugar bowl with a pasuk on it that would always face him. It didn't have Shem Hashem, so whatever. But the pasuk is from Mishlei, and it says, Einecha l'noichech yabitu. When your eyes are looking towards another person, Einecha l'noichech yabitu. When your eyes are looking to another person, Afapecha yashiru negdecha. Your eyelids should turn inward and look at yourself. Meaning, when you look at other people and you see all sorts of chesroinus in them, they're not as smart as you, they're not as good as you, they don't know as much as you. Look into yourself instead of looking down at other people. Now, Rav Yisro Zalman said the following. He said this, he was very honest. He said, on the Yomim Tovim, Sukkot, Pesach, hundreds of people come to me. They come to me. Chayav Adam, a person should visit a Rebbe, a Gadol, on Yom Tov. And they ask me questions, and they want to hear Torah. And he says, and sometimes that causes me to be margish gaiva in my heart. And I might feel I'm a little better than them, I'm higher than them. Why are they all coming to me? So I need to have that pasuk. When these thoughts come into my mind, I look at that pasuk to remember when you're looking at others and you see their chesroinus, look into yourself and look at your chesroinus. I needed that pasuk. And that pasuk was on the sugar bowl. When we couldn't find the sugar bowl, that pasuk was so important to me that I mattered writing on Chol HaMoed. Because that was a tzairach, that was a davar ha'avid. Davar ha'avid means you'll lose something if you don't do it. Like you're allowed to write Torah on Chol HaMoed if you might forget it, right, etc. Davar ha'avid. So this is the miyuchadika Yetzer Hara v'gadol. The miyuchadika Yetzer Hara v'gadol is the notion of gaiva. Everybody depends on him. Everybody looks up to him. So the pashtus of kol hagadol mechaver Yetzer gadol mimeno in context seems to be that Hashem will always give the tzaddik something to fight, because life is about struggle, life is about fighting, but the tzaddik will be fighting at a higher level. He won't be fighting at the level of the lowest, coarsest averos. He'll be fighting on gaiva. But the Rambam, that's why I'm questioning the raya. The Rambam seems to be using the raya in another way by basically saying that the greatest person, in other words, instead of saying the greater you are, the stronger your Yetzer Hara, the Rambam seems to be retranslating it by saying the greater person is the one that has the stronger Yetzer Hara. It's almost the opposite. Instead of saying the greater you are, the stronger the Yetzer Hara, it's like saying the other way around. The stronger the Yetzer Hara, the greater you are. He seems to be flipping the idea. But be it as it may, therefore, the Rambam seems to say we have a contradiction in our Messiah, which is greater. We have psukim in Mishlei that we quoted that seem to indicate that as long as you have an inclination towards evil, there's something bad about you. Right? That's the pasuk in Mishlei. And then we have the sources in Chazal that say, no, the one who struggles with the Yetzer Hara is by far the greater person. Again, I'll come back to the Tanya after this. Tanya's hundreds of years later, but he has some interesting things. So the Rambam says there is a contradiction here, but the Rambam then gives his own answer, a very, very interesting answer. And he says, sometimes, for some mitzvos and averos, it is better not to desire them at all. And if you desire the bad, that is a chisaron in your neshama. And for others, it is actually a maila to be misaveh and to be kovesh as Yitzro. And the Rambam differentiates what you might call mitzvos that are considered to be logical and represent intrinsic, averos and mitzvos, right? Some mitzvos are things that are intrinsically good, and some averos are intrinsically bad. Others are good or bad only because HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded them, but I cannot see anything intrinsic one way or the other. So the Rambam says, for example, if you take something like killing, like stealing, like anger, like selfishness, like cruelty, those are midos ra'os. Those are sicknesses of the soul. In fact, the whole Shmona Prakim is basically saying, if you have those feelings, I want to hurt people, I want to be mavaza people, I don't want to help people, there, your soul is defective if you have those negative feelings. And even if you successfully conquer Yetzer Hara, and you don't express those negative feelings, and Baruch Hashem, that's a very high madrega. We're not putting that down, but that is a pechisus. There is something defective in the soul that is filled with anger, resentment, hate, selfishness, even if you're Kovesh es Yitzro. And B'chiyai Gavna, we say that the Kovesh es Yitzro is inferior to the Chassid. The Chassid only has feelings of benevolence and kindness. But when it comes to mitzvos that are not interpersonal mitzvos per se, but mitzvos whose only value we understand is obeying the gezerah of Hashem, like keeping kosher. We wouldn't say, for example, that a person, in fact, the difference might be between is a behavior immoral or just against the Torah. For example, if I kill, I steal, right, I'm behaving in an immoral way. If I eat treif, I'm behaving in a prohibited way, but we would not call that an immoral, right? We would not call violating Shabbos, violating kashrus, not saying Shema, not wearing tefillin. We would not call that a breach of morality. It is a violation of God's will, but it is not a moral offense. It is not an ethical offense. So the Rambam says, when it comes to things that do not pertain to morality, ethics, and character, there's a much higher madrega to be Kovesh Yitzro. And that's why the Rambam points out, you will notice, that when Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, what types of averas should you desire to do? He doesn't say, a person shouldn't say, I don't want to kill, I don't want to steal. A person should say, I want to kill and I want to steal, but God said no. That's not what he said. He didn't use an example of wanting to kill or wanting to steal. Because fakert, there, a person's avodah is not to want that. But the three examples he used is, I want to eat meat and milk. Actually, Rashi, I think, brings chazer. Maybe it's a different gersa, but it's the same thing. I want to eat meat and milk. I want to wear shatnez. Although I do have difficulty understanding it. And that's probably what it means. I want to wear shatnez doesn't mean he has a fetish for wool and linen. That's not too likely. But it means he sees a beautiful, that's the context there. He sees a beautiful suit. Right? In fact, the most expensive suits happen to be shatnez. A beautiful, custom-made Italian suit, they tend to be shatnez, right? Because American suits are too cheap to use linen. Linen is a very expensive thread, so wool is used. Wool, polyester, that's a common thing, but linen is only used in the most expensive suits. So that's why the Italian custom-made suits are shatnez. So if any of you have expensive taste in clothing, please be aware that your Italian suit might in fact be shatnez. So I'm assuming when it says, I want to wear shatnez, it doesn't mean I love wool and linen, but it means I love this suit. So note the examples the Rambam says. Now the third example, though, is interesting. The Rambam mentions arayos. See, well, let me give his chiluk first, and then I'll question the example. So the Rambam says, you see that it's only offenses that are not offenses of midos and morality that you should desire to do them and be kovesh yitzitz, right? But when it comes to morality issues, you should train your morality, so to speak, to abhor. And that's why the examples are non-moral issues, chazer or basar b'chalav, shatnez, arayos. Now, I want to question that by arayos a little bit. The Rambam seems to classify arayos as a non-moral issue, similar to shatnez and similar to kashrus. Now, wouldn't that maybe make a difference there? For example, arayos could be a few things. Let's assume a person is having an affair with a married woman. What should one's attitude be towards Eishes Ish? Now, Eishes Ish, I think, is not only an offense against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Eishes Ish is a moral offense, because even if it's consensual between the man and the woman, it is a betrayal of a commitment that was made to another man. You see what I'm saying? In other words, it seems to me that if a person shouldn't have the attitude, I want to steal, but I'm not going to steal, a person shouldn't have the attitude, I want to be mazana with an Eishes Ish, but I'm not going to do it. So it could be that according to the Rambam, when it mentions arayos, it is not referring to Eishes Ish, but it might be referring to something like consensual incest. Right? A person has a taiva to be with his sister, whatever it would be. So she's happy with it, he's happy with it. There's nothing, I don't want to get arrested for this, but there's nothing intrinsically immoral with it, but Hashem said it's usher. In other words, I would differentiate that. Some arayos, I think, do fall into the realm of morality. Other arayos fall into the realm of prohibition. For those of you that have legal background. There used to be an old legal phrase between what is called malum per se versus malum prohibitum. That's a little less lesson in Latin. Malum per se are things that are evil in and of themselves. Malum prohibitum means it's not evil in and of itself, it's only evil because it's been commanded. So the Rambam says, something that's be'etzem evil, you shouldn't be misava at all. But something that's only usher because Hashem said it's usher, but it's not something that intrinsically is intellectually an evil thing, that the Rambam says Kovesh Yitzro is even a higher madrega. And that's why the Rambam says the three examples, to use the legal term, are malum prohibitum, and not malum per se. Malum is M-A-L-U-M, meaning evil, it's Latin. And the three examples are Basar B'chalav, or Rashi brings Chazer, Shatnis, and Arayas, and I would suggest on the Estaiti that the Arayas is referring to incest or Nida, or maybe Nida, it would not refer to Eshes Ish. Yeah.
Another proof to the Yitzro only specific area would be that the first proof that the Rambam brings, the context for that in the Sefek Sukkah is just a man and a woman are going on a journey together. There's no indication that they're married or anything like that.
Right. So in such a situation, kol hagadol mechavero yitzro gadol. Yeah, that's a good point. So you have to differentiate what arayas means. Yeah.
Based on this mentality where one still has the taivas, but they're refraining from them, it seems to me at least that it adds an element of depravity in one's life. So how would one go forward with this mentality, utilizing it according to the Rambam, and still do a vote of Besimcha of Torah?
Yeah. So here is something I would suggest, and again, it's a little shver to me, why the Rambam doesn't move it one step further. I think you do have to take the Rambam's analysis one step further. If we were to simply just end with what the Rambam said, that would actually mean my whole life I should have a taiva to be eating treif, and even arayas to have a taiva to be with a nida, whatever it is, but my whole life is about controlling myself, and it's almost a chisaron if I move to not having the desire anymore, which, number one, it's conducive to depression and despair, and number two, it kind of leaves you in this perpetual state of Yetzer Hara. So I would suggest the following. I think you have to add something to the Rambam here, and maybe the Rambam would be mighty to it. When the Rambam says that the Kovesh Yitzro is superior to the one who has no desire, he means the one who has no desire because he naturally is not attracted to it. Meaning, let's assume I just don't, the sight of bacon just makes me sick. So the Rambam says the one who likes bacon, but his Kovesh is Yetzer Hara, is superior to the one who simply hates bacon. But once Hashem said not to eat bacon, if I work on myself, I should eventually develop a repugnance for whatever it is Hashem doesn't want me to do. In other words, that is still called, you still have the Maila of Kovesh Yitzro, because you started as a Kovesh Yitzro. Meaning, when the Rambam says the Kovesh Yitzro is superior to the Chassid, he means at the starting point, to be Kovesh Ma'yetzer is a better level than simply not having an interest. But you then need to move from Kovesh Yitzro to a repugnance of that, but that's still called Kovesh Yitzro because what got you to the repugnance, not because you naturally didn't like bacon, but because once Hashem says not to eat bacon, you hate it. And that's what Rashi means as well. When Rashi says a person shouldn't say, I don't want to eat chazer, I want to eat it, but God said no, he doesn't mean right now I want to eat it. He means, I said, had Hashem not commanded me, I would have wanted it. Once God commands, I no longer have that desire. You see what I'm saying? In other words, now again, to me it's a bit of a tzarechin a little bit. why the Rambam doesn't take us to the next point. But I think it's going to be fairly clear that in spiritual development, one tries to align one's will to the will of God. Yeah.
Also, I heard like if a person starts to keep Shabbos and the very first Shabbos is very difficult for him, so the more difficult it is, the more sachar he gets.
Yeah.
But then, like let's say over time, he starts to like keeping Shabbos. He still gets the same sachar for the rest of his life.
Right. That's very good. That's exactly the point that I'm trying to add here. 100% correct. That is, if I say lefum tzara agra, according to the tzara is the reward, then l'chayra you would think that means there's diminishing returns because the first Shabbos are so hard for me. I get tremendous reward, and then what? I get less and less and less and less and less. The answer is no. That since all of those Shabbos later are coming from those struggles, so you're still getting the reward for those struggles, and Memela. We're saying that that's what the Rambam might say as well, that to be Kovesh, the Yitzro, is greater than the guy who naturally hates Chazer. But eventually, you also come to hate Chazer, but you're still called a Kovesh es Yitzro, because it came from Kovesh es Yitzro. You see? So that's what I would add. But again, I have to admit that the Rambam does not directly make that point here, but I think we would have to maybe superimpose it on top of all of this. Now, okay, well, we'll continue tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll talk a little bit about the Baal HaTanya's take on this. The Baal HaTanya uses a different vocabulary, but we'll discuss that a little bit just to bring it, just to connect it to. Okay, see you tomorrow.